He was the coolest heel in wrestling history, but was he ever as untouchable as the characters he created? He revolutionized the business twice, but could the man who changed wrestling ever change himself? He had fame, fortune, and brotherhood, but did he ever stop feeling empty? He said bad times don't last, but what happens when the bad times never leave? He called himself the bad guy, but was the real villain the one in the ring, or the one he couldn't defeat? This is the devastating journey of Scott Hall, a revolutionary, an icon, and a man who spent his life fighting the one opponent he could never pin.
Bad guys are not supposed to make you cry. They are supposed to cheat. They are supposed to talk trash. They are supposed to throw a toothpick in your face, smirk at the hard cam, and walk away like the whole arena belongs to them. Scott Hall did all of that, and he did it better than almost anyone. The gold chains, the greasy hair, the slow walk, the raised eyebrow, the toothpick, the accent, the swagger. Before fans had social media edits, before every wrestler was trying to be cool, Scott Hall already knew how to make one camera shot feel like a main event. He did not have to scream. He did not have to beg for a pop. He did not have to do 10 flips to get over. Scott Hall would step through the curtain, look around the building, and the people understood immediately. This guy had it. He looked like money. He talked like money. He moved like money. But behind the gimmick, behind Razor Ramon, behind the N.W.O, behind the Hall of Fame ring, there was a man who spent most of his life trying to survive himself. Because Scott Hall was not just fighting opponents. He was fighting addiction. He was fighting guilt. He was fighting shame. He was fighting a memory he could not forget. And for years, he was losing that match. This is not just a Scott Hall documentary. This is wrestling lore. This is the story of a man who changed the business, helped launch the hottest angle of the Monday Night Wars, became one of the coolest heels in history, and still went home at night feeling empty. It is the story of the N.W.O. It is the story of addiction. It is the story of friendship. It is the story of a Hall of Fame speech that hit harder than any finisher. Because when Scott Hall said, "Bad times don't last," people believed him. Not because his life was easy, because his life proved how hard that sentence really is. Before the black and white, before the ladder match, before Hey Yo, before the boys in the locker room called him one of the smartest minds in the business, Scott Hall was a kid looking for somewhere to belong. Wrestling gave him that place. To some kids, wrestling is just noise on television. Big men, bright lights, loud crowds. But to Scott, it was another world. In wrestling, pain had rhythm. Violence had rules. Good guys and bad guys made sense. The babyface fought from underneath. The heel cut him off. The comeback came at the right time. The crowd rose. The finish landed. Real life was not like that. Real life was messy. Scott came from a world where alcohol was already part of the furniture. It was around him early. It was normal, before he was old enough to understand how dangerous normal could be. He grew up moving around. He saw tension. He saw family problems. He saw adults who were supposed to be strong fall apart in private. And like many young men who do not know how to say, "I am hurt," Scott learned another language. He learned how to build a body. He learned how to look tough. He learned how to make people laugh. He learned how to be the cool guy. But cool is sometimes just armor. Scott Hall was big, 6'7", a body made for the business. The kind of frame promoters notice before you even open your mouth. But deep down, he was not chasing only wrestling. He was chasing control. Inside the ring, he could be somebody else. Outside the ring, Scott Hall had to be Scott Hall, and that was the part he struggled with. Every wrestling career has a turning point. Sometimes it is the first big pop. Sometimes it is the first title. Sometimes it is the night a promoter finally says, "Kid, you've got something." For Scott Hall, one of the biggest turning points happened before the fame, and it was not glorious. It was tragic. While working as a bouncer, Scott became involved in an incident outside a club. A gun was pulled. A struggle happened. The gun fired. A man died. The legal system cleared Scott, but trauma does not care what the paperwork says. That night became part of him. He could leave the police station. He could leave the courtroom. He could leave the city. But he could not leave the memory. And this is where the Scott Hall story becomes different from a normal wrestling biography. Because his addiction was not just about party life. It was not just about being one of the boys. It was not just about too many nights on the road. It was about a man trying to silence something inside him. The crowd could chant. The boys could laugh. The promoter could hand him a payoff envelope. The fans could ask for autographs. But when everything went quiet, the memory was still there. That is the thing about wrestling. The business gives you noise, entrance music, pyro, TV monitors, locker room jokes, road stories, arenas, airports, hotels. But eventually, every wrestler ends up alone in a room. And Scott Hall, alone in a room, was in trouble. By the early 1990s, WWF was changing. The Hulkamania era was fading. The old superhero presentation was losing steam. The company needed something sharper, not just big muscles, not just patriotic colors, not just cartoon characters. They needed edge. Scott Hall had the look, but the look alone was not enough. Then came Razor Ramon. On paper, the gimmick could have been ridiculous. A Scarface-inspired Cuban bad guy from Miami. Gold chains, chest hair, toothpick, attitude for days. In the wrong hands, it would have been a cheap imitation. But in Scott Hall's hands, it became iconic. Because Scott did not just play Razor. He understood Razor. Razor Ramon was everything Scott Hall wanted to feel. Untouchable, confident, smooth, cool, unbothered. When Razor walked through the curtain, Scott's problems stayed behind it. At least for a few minutes. That is why fans connected with him, even when he was supposed to be the heel. He was too cool to boo properly. He had that rare wrestling gift. People wanted to act like him. They wanted to flick the toothpick. They wanted to say the catchphrases. They wanted to walk into a room like Razor walked into an arena. That is when you know a gimmick has gone beyond booking. It has entered culture. But the genius of Razor was not just the costume. It was the pace. Scott Hall knew how to let moments breathe. Modern wrestling sometimes forgets that. Everybody wants to rush to the next spot. Everybody wants a "this is awesome" chant. Everybody wants the highlight clip. Scott Hall knew the power of doing less. A look, a pause, a smirk, a slow point to the camera. He could make silence feel like heat. That is why workers respected him. Because Scott Hall was not just over, he knew why he was over. Then came WrestleMania 10. Razor Ramon versus Shawn Michaels. Intercontinental Championship. Ladder match. Today, ladder matches are part of wrestling's furniture. Fans expect bodies to fly. They expect broken ladders. They expect insane bumps. They expect near-death spots. But in 1994, this was different. This was not just a match. It was a blueprint. Shawn Michaels had the speed. Razor Ramon had the presence. Together, they had timing. That match was not just about climbing a ladder. It was about pride. Shawn said he was the real champion because he had never lost the title. Razor had the belt, and the claim. The latter became the judge. No referee decision, no cheap DQ, no dusty finish. Climb. Reach. Take what is yours. That is clean wrestling storytelling. And the thing that made the match special was not only the spots, it was the selling. Every bump mattered. Every climb felt desperate. Every moment had weight. A spot fight is empty when the moves do not mean anything. Scott Hall understood that. He could work a match like a veteran because he thought like a veteran. He knew when to feed. He knew when to cut off. He knew when to let Shawn shine. And he knew when to remind the crowd that Razor was still dangerous. But the real legacy of that match is bigger than an award. It changed what wrestlers believed was possible on a major stage. It told the locker room, you can take a gimmick match and make it art. You can use weapons and still tell a story. You can innovate without losing psychology. You can make the Intercontinental title feel like the biggest prize in the company for one night. And Razor Ramon walked out of that match made, not just as a character, as a worker. Behind the curtain, Scott Hall became part of one of the most powerful friend groups in wrestling history, the Clique. Shawn Michaels, Kevin Nash, Triple H, X-Pac, Scott Hall. To fans, that name became controversial. To the boys, it meant something else. It meant protection. It meant friendship. It meant long drives. It meant talking business in rental cars until sunrise. It meant breaking down matches, finishes, promos, timing, crowd reactions. People love to reduce the Clique to backstage politics. That is lazy. Yes, they had influence. Yes, they protected each other. Yes, they rubbed people the wrong way. But they also loved the business. They studied it. They argued over it. They lived it. Scott Hall was right in the middle of that. He was not just a big guy with charisma, he was a wrestling brain. He knew how to get heat without killing the crowd. He knew how to put someone over without making himself look weak. He knew when a babyface needed sympathy and when a heel needed to take powder. But the same road that sharpened his mind also fed his addiction. The wrestling schedule in that era was brutal. Town after town, hotel after hotel, bar after bar, pills for pain, alcohol for nerves, something to sleep, something to wake up, something to perform, something to come down. And the locker room culture did not help. Back then, if you could party all night and still work the next day, people called it toughness. But that was not toughness. That was self-destruction, wearing a boys' club jacket. Scott Hall loved wrestling, but the lifestyle around wrestling gave his demons a place to hide, and then gave them a microphone.
In 1996, Scott Hall left WWF. But before he and Kevin Nash walked out the door, Madison Square Garden saw one of the most infamous moments in wrestling history. The curtain call. Hall and Nash were leaving. Shawn Michaels and Triple H were staying. In storyline terms, some of them were enemies. But after the match, they hugged in the ring. Babyfaces and heels broke kayfabe in front of the crowd. Today, that might not sound shocking. In 1996, it was a sin. The business still protected the illusion. The boys still understood the old rules. You did not expose the work, unless someone told you to. The curtain call showed fans something they were not supposed to see: friendship behind the fight. For some veterans, it was disrespectful. For younger fans, it was a crack in the wall. For the business, it was a sign of what was coming. Kayfabe was changing, and Scott Hall was about to help kick the door open. On May 27, 1996, he walked through the crowd on WCW Monday Nitro. No music, no flashy entrance, no explanation. Just Scott Hall standing where he was not supposed to be. That was the brilliance. It felt real. Fans knew him as Razor Ramon. They knew he had been on WWF television. Now he was on WCW television, speaking like an invader. Before the internet pulled every curtain back, that kind of confusion was gold. Was this a shoot?
Was WWF invading? Was WCW under attack? Who sent him? That is wrestling magic. Not because everyone knows it is real, because for a moment, nobody knows where the work ends. And once Hulk Hogan turned heel at Bash at the Beach, wrestling changed. Not slightly, completely. The New World Order was not just another faction. It was a hostile takeover angle that felt like a cultural shift. Black and white shirts, spray paint, too sweet, backstage beatdowns, handheld chaos. A feeling that anything could happen. For years, wrestling had been built around colorful baby faces and obvious villains. The N.W.O flipped that. The heels became the cool ones. Scott Hall was the key. Hulk Hogan was the biggest name. Kevin Nash was the giant with attitude. But Scott Hall brought the street-level cool. He made the N.W.O feel dangerous, without trying too hard. That is important. A lot of wrestlers try to look cool and end up looking desperate. Scott Hall looked cool because he never seemed desperate for your approval. He let you come to him. That became the N.W.O's whole energy. They did not look like they were asking fans to cheer. They looked like they were taking over, whether you liked it or not. And fans loved it. For 83 weeks, WCW Nitro beat WWF Raw in the ratings. 83 weeks. In wrestling terms, that is not just a winning streak, that is a power shift. For a while, WCW was not chasing WWF. WWF was chasing WCW, and Scott Hall helped make that happen. He was not always the world champion, but anyone who judges Scott Hall only by world titles does not understand wrestling. Some people win belts, some people change the business. Scott Hall did the second. WCW gave Scott Hall something WWF had not given him. Guaranteed money, fewer dates, more leverage, a better schedule on paper, a bigger payday. For a wrestler who had spent years breaking his body on the road, it looked like victory. But there is a brutal truth in Scott Hall's story. Getting everything you wanted does not matter if you are still carrying everything you hate. The mansion does not fix the guilt. The contract does not fix the addiction. The pop does not fix the loneliness. Scott Hall was rich. Scott Hall was famous. Scott Hall was part of the hottest act in wrestling. And he was still falling apart. WCW's environment made it worse. Guaranteed contracts meant top stars had more freedom. The N.W.O was printing money, so people tolerated behavior they should not have tolerated. The backstage structure became loose. The inmates were not fully running the asylum, but some nights, it sure looked close. And Scott Hall needed structure. He needed people to tell him no. Instead, the business kept rewarding the character, while the man underneath got worse. His drinking became harder to ignore. His reliability suffered. His performances became uneven. The same man who once understood every beat of a match was now sometimes struggling to get through the night. This is the ugly side of wrestling fame. The crowd pays to see the gimmick, but the gimmick cannot save the person wearing it. One of the worst decisions WCW made was turning Scott Hall's real addiction into television. That was not edgy. That was not brave. That was exploitation. There is a difference between using reality to deepen a wrestling character and putting a man's real illness on display for heat. WCW crossed that line. Fans could feel it. This was not fun heel work. This was not a clever worked shoot promo. This was not good heat. It was uncomfortable because people knew too much of it was real. The business loves to say, use what is real. But not everything real should be used. Some things need help, not a segment. For Scott's family, it was worse. Because fans could change the channel, his children could not change who their father was becoming. His wife could not change what alcohol did to him. His friends could not simply cut a promo and fix it. The addiction was not an angle. It was a disease. And every time wrestling treated it like entertainment, Scott Hall became less of a person and more of a spectacle. That is where the tragedy deepened, because the same industry that gave him purpose also helped expose his lowest moments. After WCW collapsed, WWE brought the N.W.O back in 2002. On paper, it should have been huge. Hall, Nash, Hogan, back in WWE. A dream angle. But wrestling history is full of ideas that look better on paper than they feel in the ring. By then, Scott Hall was not the same man. The timing was off. The magic was thinner. The addiction was louder. The joy was fading. At WrestleMania 18, Scott Hall faced Stone Cold Steve Austin. Think about the strange poetry of that. The bad guy against the Texas Rattlesnake. Two men who understood how to make rebellion sell tickets. But Austin's character was built around beer-drinking chaos. And for Scott Hall, beer was not just a prop. It was temptation. The business had moved on. The Attitude Era had changed the style. The audience had changed. Scott Hall's body had changed. His mind had changed. And WWE saw it. The old Razor Ramon was crisp, focused, sharp, a worker who cared about the details. The 2002 version was struggling. Then came the infamous plane ride from hell, a charter flight full of exhausted wrestlers, alcohol, bad decisions, and behavior that became part of wrestling's darkest backstage folklore. Scott Hall was fired soon after. And just like that, what should have been one more major run was over. Not because he lacked talent. Talent was never the issue. Reliability was. In wrestling, the boys will forgive a lot if you can still go. Promoters will forgive even more if you still draw. But eventually, everyone reaches the same question. Can we trust you? For Scott Hall, too often, the answer became no. After WWE, Scott Hall kept appearing. TNA, Indies, conventions, one-off bookings. But the question around him changed. It was no longer, how great will Scott Hall be tonight? It became, will Scott Hall make it tonight? That is a terrible sentence for any wrestler, especially one who had once been so smooth, so sharp, so automatic. Fans would show up wanting to see their childhood hero. Sometimes they got a glimpse of him. Other times, they saw what addiction had done. And the internet made it worse. In the old days, a bad night in a small building might become a rumor. Now it became a clip. Uploaded, shared, mocked, discussed. Replay after replay after replay. The fall became content. That is one of the cruelest parts of modern wrestling fandom. People say they love the legends, but sometimes they watch their lowest moments like entertainment. Scott Hall's decline was not a storyline anymore. It was real life, with no booker, no finish, no comeback spot guaranteed. His health collapsed, his body weakened, his heart suffered. His addiction kept dragging him back. By the early 2010s, many fans were not asking if Scott Hall would recover. They were asking when the headline would come. That is how dark it got. Then Diamond Dallas Page stepped in. DDP had already helped Jake the Snake Roberts, another wrestling legend, whose life had been damaged by addiction and pain. Now Scott Hall needed help. But help only works when the person is ready to stop running. At first, Scott looked far away from recovery. His hip was bad. His body was broken down. He was struggling to walk. The swagger was gone. The cool was buried under years of damage. But DDP did not approach him like a promoter. He approached him like a friend. That matters. Scott Hall did not need another booking. He needed a lifeline. Fans raised money for his medical needs, and the wrestling world, after years of watching him fall, finally got to watch him fight back. Not in a ladder match, not in a tag match, not in a main event, in a living room, in rehab, in therapy, in small steps. At first, standing was a victory, then walking, then showing up clear-headed, then laughing again, then looking like Scott Hall again. Not Razor Ramon, Scott, the man. And that comeback mattered because it was not clean. It was not a Hollywood ending. Recovery is not a 3-minute montage. Recovery is boring. Recovery is brutal. Recovery is repetition. Recovery is facing the thing you used alcohol to avoid. For Scott, that meant facing the trauma that had followed him since the shooting, the night he survived legally, but not emotionally. That was the wound. Addiction was the blood. For years, the WWE Hall of Fame meant something different to Scott Hall. To some wrestlers, it is a nice honor, a speech, a ring, a weekend with old friends. For Scott, it was validation. It meant the business had not only remembered the bad nights, it meant the company still saw the greatness. The ladder match, the Intercontinental title, the N.W.O, the influence, the cool, the mind for the business, all of it. In 2014, Scott Hall was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame as Razor Ramon. But that night was not just about Razor. That night was about Scott. Because Scott did not walk out looking like a punchline. He walked out like a survivor. Clean, clear, emotional, alive. The crowd did not just cheer for Razor Ramon. They cheered because Scott Hall had made it to the stage. Every person watching knew this could have ended differently. It almost did. And then came the line. Hard work pays off. Dreams come true. Bad times don't last, but bad guys do. That line worked because it was not a catchphrase anymore. It was testimony. It was a man standing in front of the wrestling world saying, "I was almost gone. I embarrassed myself. I hurt people. I lost years. I lost pieces of my family. I lost control. But I am here." That is why the line still lives. Not because it is clever, because Scott Hall had earned the right to say it. After the Hall of Fame, Scott Hall had something to give. Not just nostalgia. Knowledge. He worked with younger wrestlers. He gave advice. He watched matches. He broke down promos. And he did it the Scott Hall way. Direct. If something was bad, he said it was bad. That is rare now. A lot of people in wrestling give soft feedback because they want to be liked. Scott Hall was not built like that. If a match had no psychology, he would say so. If a promo sounded fake, he would say so. If a guy was doing too much, he would tell him to slow down. If someone was chasing spots instead of emotion, he would call it out. That is old school. Not bitter old school, useful old school. Because Scott understood something every young wrestler needs to learn. Moves do not get you over by themselves. Moments do. A cutter can get a pop. A dive can get a pop. A near fall can get a pop. But a character gets remembered. Scott Hall knew character. He knew how to make people wait. He knew how to let the camera find him. He knew that a heel should not look like he is working hard to be hated. He also understood that wrestling is not just athletics. It is rhythm. It is trust. It is timing. It is making the other guy better. It is knowing when to feed, when to shine, when to bump, when to sell, and when to shut up. That was his gift. Even after addiction took so much from him, the wrestling mind was still there. And when young talent listened, they got better. One of the most emotional parts of Scott Hall's later life was watching his son, Cody Hall, step into wrestling. That had to be complicated. Imagine being the son of Scott Hall. On one hand, your father is a legend. On the other hand, That name comes with pressure most people cannot understand. Fans do not just look at you. They compare you. They look for the walk, the size, the cool, the timing, the natural presence. Cody had the size. But being Scott Hall's son in wrestling is not a normal starting point. It is a blessing and a burden. For Scott, seeing his son in the ring meant something deep, because wrestling had taken so much from him: time with family, peace, health, years of stability. But wrestling had also given him identity. So when he saw Cody step into that world, there was pride. Not just because his son was working, because Scott could finally pass something on besides pain. That matters. For a man who carried so much regret as a father, those moments meant more than a title belt. But this story is not a fairy tale, and it should not be written like one. Scott Hall did not beat addiction once and then walk into the sunset. That is not how addiction works. Recovery is a daily fight. Some days you win, some days you slip. Some days the old voice comes back and tells you the bottle is the answer. The pandemic years were hard on many people in recovery. Isolation is dangerous. For someone like Scott Hall, being alone was never just being alone. It meant being alone with memory, alone with guilt, alone with pain, alone with the parts of himself he had spent decades trying to numb. There were relapses, there were scary moments, and that does not erase the comeback. It makes it more honest. People want redemption stories to be neat. They want a clean 3-act structure: fall, recovery, victory. Real life is uglier: fall, recovery, relapse, shame, try again, fall again, reach out, hide, come back, try again. That is why Scott Hall's story is powerful. Not because he became perfect, because he kept trying, after the world had already written the ending.
Scott Hall was not a saint. Do not clean him up too much. That would be dishonest. He hurt people. He failed people. He embarrassed himself. He wasted chances. He lost control. But he also gave wrestling something permanent. He gave fans moments they will never forget. He gave the boys lessons they still repeat. He gave the business a kind of cool that cannot be manufactured. And in the end, he gave people one last image: a man who had been to the top of the mountain and the bottom of the gutter, standing on a Hall of Fame stage, alive, humbled, and finally able to hear the cheer without running from himself. That is why Scott Hall still matters. Not because he was perfect, because he was real. The bad guy was a character. The man behind him was wounded, talented, funny, brilliant, destructive, loyal, broken, and unforgettable. And maybe that is why fans still feel something when they hear that music, see that toothpick, or watch him step through the crowd on Nitro, because Scott Hall did not just work the crowd, he left a mark on them. Bad times don't last, but bad guys do, and Scott Hall always will. Scott Hall was more than the bad guy. He was Razor Ramon. He was the soul of the N.W.O invasion. He was the man behind one of wrestling's greatest ladder matches. And he was a survivor whose Hall of Fame speech still hits hard. So now, I want to ask you, what do you think is Scott Hall's greatest legacy? Razor Ramon, the N.W.O, the Shawn Michaels ladder match, or his comeback story? Comment, bad guys do, and tell us your favorite Scott Hall moment below.